pray. Gracious and most holy God, we ask your blessing upon this Sunday. This day of stewardship that we celebrate the gifts, the talents that you have blessed us with. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you. Amen. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. A pastor had just finished preaching his sermon one Sunday. A sermon about talents. And a gentleman in the congregation came up to him right after the service and said, I heard your sermon, but just so you know, I was listening. And he says, I don't have any kind of musical abilities. I cannot sing in the choir. I can't keep a tune. I can't teach Sunday school because I can't remember anything. I don't have handy skills, so I couldn't be on the property committee. But you know, I think I've realized what my talent is. I have the talent of criticism. Because I know how to criticize the church council. I know how to criticize your sermons. I know how to criticize the choir. Pastor, what do you think I could do with that talent? And he thinks about it for a minute and thinks, well, you think back to that passage that we reflected on today. What did the third servant do with his one talent? And the gentleman responds back, well, he buried it in the ground. And he said, well, if you take that advice, your talent of criticism, you too can do the same thing. Bury it in the ground because the church and your master will both appreciate it. Today we talk about stewardship. Now, stewardship is a multitude of different things in the Christian understanding. Stewardship, in many minds, when you think of stewardship, you think of money and you start to cringe and grit your teeth thinking, oh no, he's going to ask for something. But stewardship begins with God. It's much more than money. It's about sharing what resources God has blessed us with. Charles Stoughton defines stewardship as everything you do after you say yes to Jesus. After we've been called by God to come into a Christian community, after our baptism where we've been blessed by God, when we enter into a relationship with God and with a community, we are blessed and we are stewards in God's place. Stewardship begins with God and the understanding that all that we have ultimately comes from God. It goes way back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, where God made creation. God made the earth. God made everything in the earth, and God instructed humanity to have dominion over it. And what dominion over it means to take care of. Take care of the earth. Take care of the things that we have in our possession. To be a trustee of, to be owners of, to be caretakers of. Stewardship begins with God. There's 4 things I want to highlight about what stewardship is. The first is stewardship is more than giving to the church. It is a defined lifestyle. So it's what we do. It's our lifestyle and how we conduct ourselves when we get up in the morning thinking about how we can best make use of our resources. The second thing that stewardship is a way of giving to Christ all that we have. It's committing to Christ. It's committing everything that we have to God's purposes in the world. Third thing is stewardship begins inside of our heart. Our heart is where we love and where we care and where we have compassion. Stewardship begins within our heart because when our heart is touched and transformed, we feel blessed. And when our heart is changed, we then in turn want to share that transformation with others. We want to share the blessing that we've received with other people. And the fourth thing, stewardship is about God. It's not about the church. It's not about people. It's about God and all that God is in our lives. Reflecting on today's passage from Matthew 25, Jesus tells that parable of the talents, where a landowner goes off for a very long time. And he entrusts 3 of his servants with his property. The first servant, or slave in some translations, he entrusts 5 talents. Now, as Greg alluded to, a talent could be something like a year and a half's wages. It's a lot of money. So he entrusts that one with the 5 talents. The second slave or servant he entrusts with just 2 talents. And then the third one he entrusts with just 1. So the landowner goes off for a very long time. And when he comes back, he goes back to those servants, and it first goes to the one that was given 5 talents. And he says, "Show me what you've done with your 5 talents." And the servant comes and says, "Master, you'll be very proud of me. I've invested my 5 talents and I've multiplied it, and now I have 10 talents. 100% investment. Imagine if your broker did that too. Wouldn't you be happy?" I know I would. He goes and says, "Good and faithful servant. Well done." He's proud of his servant. He goes to the second one, who comes back with his 2 talents, but he's multiplied it to 4. He now has also doubled his talents. And he says to him, "Good and faithful servant, well done." And he goes to the last one, the third servant, and he says, "Show me what you've done with yours." And he hands his talent back to the landowner. And there's only just the 1 talent. He says, "What happened? Where's the rest?" "Well, I knew that you were a very difficult landowner and very serious, but I didn't want to get in trouble. So I wanted to protect that investment. So here it is." I said, "You wicked and lazy servant, what did you do with my..." "Well, I buried it in the ground." "Oh, okay." So we think about that parable and what we do with our talents. In the scriptures, there's a series of 3 parables that are right in the row. There's a parable of the bridesmaids. There's the parable of the sheep and the goats, and the parable of the talents. And in each one, they use the term "goes away for a very long time." The landowner, or the owner, or the keeper, or God, goes away for a long time. But when they return, we never know when that time will be. We never know when the Lord will return. So we need to be prepared. And that's what those parables are about. That we need to invest our time, our efforts, our money into God's purposes, for we never know when the Lord will return. But let's go back a minute to think about that third slave. Some may consider him the star of the story, or perhaps the villain, as he didn't really do much at all with his talent. Think about what he did or didn't do with that 1 talent. Perhaps he buried it in the ground because he feared failure. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to do anything wrong. He feared what the landowner might do for him if he lost it. And it didn't produce anything. Think about the times that we've had a talent and we were afraid to use it because we feared failure. Maybe we know how to play guitar and we've never shown anybody. Or maybe we are an accountant and yet we've never shared that gift with others. Maybe we have the ability to sing and we haven't come forward to be part of the choir or sing a solo. The third servant could have been fearing of failure. sometimes with our talents we need to take a risk and give it to God and ask God to touch us and carry us into that risky situation that is new and unfamiliar. The second thing that you might think about with that third one is he thinks of if only. If only I were good enough. If only I had invested it properly. He was afraid of not being good enough. If only he could have done that. If only I could have spoken better. If only I could have acted more. If only I could have, and you can fill in the blank. There's a story that I'd like to share about a 38-year-old cleaning woman in the 1900s. This 38-year-old cleaning woman, one day and over a period of time, kept going into a movie theater. And she'd be sitting watching the show and thinking, if only I were prettier. If only I were talented like those actors. And then she would go to concerts and think, if only I was able to sing and keep a tune. But she wasn't able to act in that. The if-onlys in our life sometimes get in the way of being productive and doing something worthwhile and sharing our talents with others. Until one day, someone pointed out a book to this 38-year-old cleaning woman. It's called The Magic of Believing. And she read that book, and the book speaks about how to change your life from focusing on the if-onlys, you're not good enough, to what you're good at. Focus on the positives, the things that you are gifted on, rather than the things that you're not. How many of us have thought about the things we're not good at, and yet we don't look to our strengths for the things that we are gifted and good at? All of us have gifts. All of us have talents to be used. That individual I'm speaking of was Phyllis Diller. Phyllis Diller is one who had a scratchy voice. She maybe didn't have some talents in many ways, but she focused her energy on what she was good at. And if you remember back from the last century, she was a comedian. She was good at telling stories. She was good at making people laugh. And at the peak of her career in the 1960s, she was making $1 million, which was an extraordinary amount of money in that day. She just died 2 years ago, but she made herself a household name because of her comedic efforts of using her talent, not for the if only, but focusing in on her strength. And then the third thing that is important is that at the heart of the issue is that people can have an impact on what they do. No matter who you are, no matter what your talent is, you can have an impact on what your talent can be. That third servant failed to realize the kind of impact that he could have made, but he chose not to. He chose not to have an impact. Yesterday and Friday night, we had a session for sharing our thoughts around the future of St. Andrew's. And we discussed the possibilities for vision and purpose on who we are. We're working with a consultant by the name of Dwayne Whitty, who got us thinking about the big sky, the blue sky, thinking about the possibilities. Thinking about what we are gifted in, what we want to do, what we feel God calling us to do. And what God is calling us to do is bound together. Be a community of faith that cares about others, that cares about the community around us, that cares about using our talents that God has equipped us with for the sake of others around us. What I think was really striking as a thread through the conversations yesterday is that although we may not have had a clear picture about what exactly our mission or vision is going into that conversation, what we came out of was a very clear thread that we can be a church that cares about the needs of others outside of ourselves. that cares for the community, looking toward the needs of the community. And how we can make a difference and make an impact on people's lives is by using our talents that God has gifted us with. When we think about stewardship and using the talents God has gifted us with, we are to not sit on them, but rather explore them and rather exercise them and share them with others. Out of that conversation yesterday, we came up with a vision statement, and it says this: our vision at St. Andrew's is to be faithfully supporting our growing community by identifying unique needs and delivering transformational solutions. Delivering transformational solutions. Going out of this place, identifying the needs of who's around us. How can we make an impact? How can we help to transform their lives? Our stewardship is using our time, our talents, our wealth, our money, our offerings, so that it can be a benefit of others. When we have an identified clarity of our focus and mission as a congregation, we know where we're going. We know that when we contribute to the church and when we exercise the use of our talents, we know they're going toward a purpose that is clear and needed in our community. Stewardship begins with God. It begins with all of us in exercising the talents and the gifts that we were blessed with and not holding them back. Not thinking, if only I were good enough, if only I were this, but rather taking that risk. Stewardship is about sacrifice. It's about taking risks of faith in who we are as a church. And I think when we expand on the possibility of our new vision, it's about taking risks. It's about stepping out of the comfort zone of what we're familiar with, but moving into new territory, moving into a new idea for ministry that can make an impact and change lives in our community. Stewardship begins with God. Amen.